Hot news: United Ave is the new name for Confederate Ave in Atlanta. Harry's how name, but she doesn't. Not anymore. In late November, city workers drove up and down Confederate and East Confederate Avenues in Atlanta and replaced old street signs with new ones that renamed the 1.5-mile stretch. Wow. It's a small change, one new word on their mail, address labels and documents. And yet it's so much. What happened in this neighborhood is not unlike the discussions playing out in cities across the South, where officials are debating what to do with streets and monuments that honor the legacy of the Confederacy. But residents here, instead, the neighbors for a new name, as they called themselves, took matters into their own hands. It may not seem like much, after all, but ahead of United Avenue's formal commemoration on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and their city councilwoman says their grassroots campaign could serve as a blueprint for how other communities in Atlanta, whose slogan is how the street got its name. United Avenue is a quiet, mostly residential street that runs southeast from historic Grant Park and contains a mix of homes, churches, an apartment complex and several state government offices. It lies within a mile of historic Oakland Cemetery, where more than 6,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. But Confederate and East Confederate Avenues were not named directly after the Confederacy per se, according to Sheffield Hale, president and CEO of the Atlanta History Center. Their namesake was, the state acquired the soldiers' home in 1900, and it opened in 1901. The last Confederate. 50 years later, Friesen and Bywin would get involved in an early effort to change the street's name after 9 black churchgoers were massacred at Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. The couple, who are black, moved into their home on Confederate Avenue after getting married in 2003, despite the name at first, but he changed his mind after the 2015 Charleston shooting, carried out by a young gunman who posted a racist manifesto online alongside pictures of him posing with the Confederate flag. What was most disturbing to Bywin about the massacre was that it was carried out by a 21-year-old, not an old white man who grew up in the segregated South. Your address is part of your identity. The conversation about renaming the streets is years old, according to Atlanta City Councilwoman Carla Smith, who represents the neighborhood. Over the years, Smith said she heard complaints from people who decided not to move into a house they loved simply because it sat on Confederate or East Confederate. The name didn't stop Jeanette Gayer and her family from moving onto Confederate Avenue in May 2017. But still, Gayer noticed it whenever she went home or gave her street name out to friends, which hammered. So when it came time to change the street's name, it was important to Smith that the decision rested with people who actually lived there. Because an early effort to rename the street John Lewis Boulevard after the Atlanta congressman and civil rights activist soon fizzled. Then came the national reckoning that followed deadly clashes in Charlottesville, Virginia, in August 2017, when white supremacists converged on the city to protest the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. After Charlottesville, Atlanta's then-Mayor Qasim Reed formed an advisory committee to look into removing the city's Confederate monuments and streets. Among the committee's, at this point, residents had already revived their work to rename the street. The committee's support at Neighbors for a New Name. Not long after Charlottesville, Friesen and Bywin were approached by a neighbor who asked if they'd want to help find a new name for Confederate Avenue. The effort was egalitarian and collaborative, Friesen told CNN. A core group of, there weren't any formal positions, Friesen said, but different people fulfilled different roles. Every time Eventually, the neighbors needed a petition showing that 50% of residents along Confederate and East Confederate supported the initiative, Smith said. Neighbors for a New. When the residents met to turn in their petitions, Smith said she was incredibly moved by seeing the fruits of her constituents' labor. That after another round of door knocking, street residents were given ballots to vote on the new name. Gayer said that what? Among the other names considered were Soldiers, a nod to the historic Veterans Home, Gayer said Considerate, and Coretta. But United was the clear winner. And no, the people. A perversion of history? The petitions allowed Smith to put legislation before the city council. But first, not everyone who showed up supported the name change. Will Dean said had lived on East Confederate Avenue since 2004 and loved everything about living there, including. But he also felt the name change carried historical implications as well. Some people who don't live on the street, like David Moreland, came to weigh in on the issue as well. Do ancestors on both sides of his family proudly. But most attendees that night were in full support. The residents said. One speaker was Arthur Breland, the first African-American pastor in the 90-year history of Woodland Hills Baptist Church on Confederate Avenue. He joined the effort. Besides the name change, Breland wanted the neighborhood to continue having conversations about racial issues in their neighborhood. When Breland stepped to the podium that night in September, he addressed claims that renaming the street would erase history. A neighborhood united. After review by other Atlanta regulatory bodies, the City Council passed Smith's legislation unanimously on October 1. 2 days later, according to Smith, another group of residents are working to memorialize the street name, likely with a piece of granite that will sit on the former site of the Confederate Veterans Home and explain the street's history. Smith believes the work of Neighbors for a New Name could be used to guide other Atlanta neighborhoods that want to change street names. Smith likes that the residents took charge instead of relying on their city council member to do all the work. Friesen said she hopes other communities can learn from what hers did and can follow their example to tackle similar issues.
Raindrop, drop top smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park pot.